You so much, Darby. Thank you, Dr. Behman. Thank you, King. I really appreciate all of you. I'm not going to do like a PowerPoint. There's a lot of us here. So, what I'd like to do is kind of give you a brief overview of how I got into this, why I'm doing it, why it's important for us as clinicians, and maybe dispel some myths around it and then take questions. Certainly, you can put them in the chat. I'd love to also hear your little voices. I know it's harder for people to speak when there's a lot of people here, but I would absolutely love to hear your voices as well. So the reason my name is Coreen Haym. I've been at MFT for forever. I don't know, 18 years or something like that. But prior to that, I did a lot of other things. I had a lot of different careers. I'm a nomad. I travel around a lot. That being said, I have been involved personally in the BDSM movement and in the community on and off for almost 25 years. My first introduction to it was 18 or 19 in New York City, and we're talking about a long time ago. So everything was underground, secretive, and very, very judged. It was not discussed the way it's discussed now in the communities, particularly in our clinical communities, where, as many of you have already discovered and learned in your internship, you actually cannot avoid certain presenting issues to coming in for you. And I know a lot of people are like, I don't want to work with this. But when you have a client for 10 weeks, and then one of the 65% of people who disclose this to the therapist discloses, we want you to be what we call at least kink friendly, if not kink affirming, so that people understand that we're not sitting back in old literature and old research about what this means. Now, many years ago, well over 100 years ago, this was considered a sin, much like same gender, sexual orientation or behavior, that kind of thing, regardless of what you call yourself, this was considered a sin. But as we move forward, and there was more research on it, it moved into sickness. Now you're ill, we're going to help you. And this does sound familiar as far as sexuality and sexual orientation. So I definitely wanted to. Oh, and also on the flyer, it did talk about consensual non-monogamy. That is another area. They're two separate areas, just like we talk about gender and sexuality. There's crossover, but they're two separate areas. Many people who are involved in kink at different levels may be consensually non-monogamous, but they do not go together. Does that make sense? Um, so that being said, I've been working doing this. I think my first poster on this, which was nerve-wracking for me, I'm like, I'm putting this out there. I'm gonna get fired. I'm gonna get all the things that you get afraid of when you work with sexuality, particularly when work with what at the time was considered an edge sexuality. So, like most things you can't avoid, you can focus, but you need to at least be in that non-judgmental understanding and at least baseline educated about some of these things, right? Like in any of our what we call cultural competence, which I like to call cultural sensitivity because you're never finished with this work, right? Around cultural sensitivity, we always all have work to do, which is kind of an exciting part of our profession. Thank you, Darby. Also, MFT is just so you know, you're already prepared to practice sex therapy because you've had a full course in it. You don't have to get an AMFT certification to practice sex therapy, while as LCSWs, LCPCs, and possibly psychologists, I think they are actually okay to do it too because they have courses in sexuality. We can already do this. We can't necessarily call ourselves a sex therapist without being certified by what's called ASECT, which is another subject, but we absolutely are committed to doing this as well. Because if you're working with couples, you're going to be working with sex and sexuality, or individuals, obviously. So it's moved from sin to sickness. And then as we do more research, as we interview more people, as we do more qualitative research, mixed methods, we start to understand that we're moving toward a, where is it? Oh, we're moving more toward a choice and a freedom over our personal sexual activities. And as therapists, regardless of any political, whatever, as therapists, this is important and part of our ethics. Um, so I want to talk about what it's not, because these are some of the myths that come out. And there was a good research study done. I think it was Colmo was the name of the researcher, talked about what are the myths. And then we go back to a movie like 50 Shades of Grey. How many of you have seen that just by hand because you're on the, okay. Um, Not by hand. Some of you, it's probably a big turn on. Um, for other people, like us involved in the community, it literally explained every single myth that was there, every single unfact about that. So that being said, it's not a result, and what I'm telling you is research, this ultra research, not just an article. It's not a result of trauma. As a matter of fact, we find the exact same level of abuse and trauma in the kink community and people who practice kink that we do in the people who do not. It's exactly the same. So that part of it goes out the window. The other thing is it is consensual. These are consensual practices. And as us having control over our own bodies, our own pleasure, these are consensual activities. We do not, it's quite the opposite. I think that consent is a very high focus in these communities because we have to have an understanding of what's consensual or not. Because if you walk in on a certain scene, it may not look consensual in a traditional mindset, but it's incredibly, this is the idea. Are there consent violations? Yes. And they happen at the same rate that they happen in other situations. Are there problems with interpersonal relationships? Yes. And they happen at the same rate that they happen in other relationships. What we do notice is a difference is that we do find that the females, people who identify as female, are a little personality wise less rejection sensitive than your average population. My gut feeling, we don't know this yet, is it has to do with play parties and understanding that this is not necessarily a personal rejection, but how do we fit together? That being said, there's newer movies out. How many of you have seen Baby Girl or Secretary? Baby Girl just came out. Little better. Secretary, a lot better. But in all of these movies, there's a discovery of this rather than I understand that I like this and I'm going to play in this way and I'm going to do it in this way. So none of the movies out there have really put that forward, but that's the reality. The dangerous part, and this is why I'm doing this, is that people watch a couple YouTube videos of sexperts or Instagram. Let's do it. And now we have a problem. People can be practicing both power dynamics in, people want to say, oh, I want to jump into a 24/7 power dynamic without experimentation, without education, without some community around them. Most of the time, that's not done in a great way. Currently seeing a couple right now where they and us as a threesome, right? Not that kind of threesome, but I'm their clinician. But we actually talked about and decided together that because of what they're going through, we actually took the power dynamic out of the 24/7 relationship, which was very hard for them because they need to rebuild it. And they understand, they're like, we did not build it in a healthy way. We did not have education around this. Fantasies do not equal actions. They can, but often they don't equal actions. What gets us going here may not translate very well into the actions that you actually want to do. This is controversial, but I do believe fantasies that's your brain. That's okay. Even if you have a fantasy that seems very taboo, that does not mean you're going to put that into action. And I know that's a myth out there as well, particularly around pedophilic fantasies. We immediately feel that that means it's a slippery slope, but it's not. Majority of people who will abuse children also have some antisocial traits, if not complete antisocial personality, because they're no longer caring about the rights of others and they're gaining pleasure from their harm, not from spanking or things like that that people are enjoying on both sides, but harming them emotionally and potentially physically at a level that they will never come back from, or it's very hard for them to come back from. So, that being said, we have a primarily white heterosexual presentation in the media. And that is also not the case of practitioners. There are all levels of practitioners. There are people who make this their whole identity. They're leaders in the community. They're leaders in the group. They go to conferences. We have many conferences that are pretty cool. And they win these leather pageants and they have titles. There are other people that might just dabble and pretty much everything in between. A 24/7 relationship, which is out there in the media, is the least practiced of the BDSM situations and comes with a lot of care, responsibility, and communication. Okay, one more thing, and then I kind of want to open it up to questions. And I do have something that I could go over, but I'd rather put it in the chat. And they are guidelines for clinicians. What do we need to do to be kink friendly? Kink aware is the next step. Kink affirmative is the next step, but we want to at least have an understanding so we don't look like this. I mean, imagine going to a medical doctor for some problem and they're like, oh my God, I've never seen that before. It's not a good feeling. So very similar type of thing. There's problems with this being in the mainstream without proper education and introduction. There's also problems with secrecy, being closeted. And if you can only imagine, and I'm going to give you one example of this, but children have been taken away from very good parents simply because of these practices being put out in courtrooms. So this is serious stuff for us. You will come across it no matter what rural environment you're in because you will hear things as clinicians you won't hear out in the real world because we're trying to develop what? Safety and trust and non-judgmental atmosphere. Without those baselines, we're not very great clinicians, right? Um, so there are people who look at this as what's called an orientation, while some people who have different sexual orientations or even heterosexual, any sexual orientation are like, is this really an orientation that we're kind of born with? Other people classified in something called serious leisure. And if you do not know, there's a whole field called leisure studies. Started with, again, a bunch of white men in Britain, big surprise. And at the time when that first came out, they were like, it was very kind of sexist. They were like, women love doing housework, that's their serious leisure. Um, as we know, not all of us really love doing that. But so this is important for all genders, all races, all everything. Ooh, I wanted to get that comment. What was that one
I
Bethany
have
just
it.
said? Yeah, it was Bethany, I think.
So Bethany says, my instincts say that we should have consensual BDSM documents and contracts and files, just like safety plans, to protect both clients and ourselves. Agree or disagree?
Gray, yes and no. I'm going to answer that real quick, say my last thing, then we'll just go to questions. So, Bethany, here's the thing about contracts that can be a little fuzzy. Contracts are what we call them. Contracts are something you sign that says this is it until I don't sign it anymore or withdraw it. So, what we like to have are agreements. And so I think agreements can be negotiated 24/7. At any time, you can take off that hat and negotiate an agreement. Otherwise, we're messing with consent. I have to do this. I signed a contract. But in your file, absolutely, because you want to work with them. How often are you having what I like to call firesides? I'm aging myself, but I got that from Jimmy Carter. Rest in peace. Fireside chats. And I have taken that where you have a time, you sit down, and it's usually weekly. And when they're just starting out, I do it every day if they can, if they commit to it, for an hour to half an hour to an hour, where they talk about what's working, what's not working, and what they're not sure about that we need to be careful about. Every day, if they're just kind of figuring it out. And this is good, even like I said, 24/7 is not the common picture. The common picture is let's have fun with some stuff. Let's do a little flogging. Let's do a power dynamic. And so thorough conversation about the relationship. Exactly. What are you agreeing to? But this can change at any moment with a verbal period. So that being said, the serious leisure thing, the orientation thing, the personality traits research, I'm not as interested in. I'm not as interested about ideology, period. I'm not interested in where this came from. I'm interested, is it coming from an empowered place? Are you safe? Is it as old words, sane as possible and consensual? And all of these have great places, and it's hard for us in our heart to think that there's gray in consent, but there is sometimes. So that being said, as clinicians, we're always going to believe our clients if something is non-consensual and align with our clients and all of that. But there are difficult situations that come up with this. Additionally, I've done a couple presentations on what is abuse and what is okay outside. We're watching for abuse because it can be covered up more easily. That's just our dynamic in a BDSM world. Now, it happens just as often in another world, but people will come into play parties like, this is just how this is. Like, she has bruises, sure, but this was consensual. Where if you see bruises in a different context, you're going to be like, okay, something happened. You know, so actually differentiating that in the community and looking for certain signs, I've done a whole presentation on because we really, really want to be careful. So what I'd love to do right now with that small, miniature, minuscule, teeny weeny introduction, because there's so much here, is open it up to questions. And I will go ahead and put those guidelines. They're wonderful. They're recent in the chat. There's an article associated with them. And let's go for it.
Before we start, there was someone who had
Yes,
asked earlier, and I just wrote hers down so it didn't get lost. But
thank you.
someone said, how much do you affirm, challenge, reflect back when clients pathologize their kinks or have had them pathologize previously, or ask, is this why I like XYZ? She also said, thanks for this. I work nearly exclusively with the E&M polyamory kink, and I'm so grateful for you.
Who is this?
Uh, if you are that person, please come out because I didn't copy your name. I'm so sorry. Oh, wait, this is Autumn.
Autumn. Okay, awesome. I would say the majority of my clients are in either the CNM, the DS, we call dominance and submission DS community, or what I like to call power. Authority exchange is even a more recent word developed by Sinclair Sexsmith and some others. You know Sinclair?
Yeah.
Excellent. I was at a session last night. Adore,
Oh,
right? Yes.
magic. Yes.
I know, magic. Okay, we'll get off the Sinclair train in a moment. We're like, okay.
I'm like fandom. Yes.
Yes, big time. Yeah, and I don't really do that for people. Um, so yes, I think I am very affirming. And when they actually say, "Where does this come from?" that often comes from a pathologizing mindset. And what I often talk about is it's really dealing it with the same way that you might deal with somebody who's non-heterosexual. Where does this come from? Okay, I don't know. Everybody has a different experience. What I do know is that often comes from a place of you're worried that somehow you were formed into this. Everything we are is a result of our genetics in combination. We know the feedback loop in systemic therapy in combination with every moment in our environment, not just the big trauma or the big amazing things, right? So you are you. And so I actually often ask what is the importance of knowing where it came from? And then that gets into a conversation of pathologizing. I'm very affirming. I'm also ask a lot of questions about the history. If somebody has been abused and has a kink, because there's a lot of people who've been abused and happens to have a kink, 9 times out of 10 they come in thinking it's connected because that's what society has told us, but that's not what the research says at all.
Yeah. And that's what I have happen with clients all the time is coming in and saying, this happened, so that's why I like this. And I feel super bad about it. It's really gross. And they can't, the detangling is hard.
It is hard. Also, with the sex addiction movement, there is a lot of the proper way to have sex. It has to be intimate. It has to be with one person, generally heterosexual. So, in the sex addiction movement, it's not necessarily purposefully shameful, but it can be if somebody is in consensual non-monogamy, kink, or even just not having sex with somebody who's of the clear opposite sex
Right.
or other sex. So Autumn, as far as I'm concerned, I do affirm while keeping a neutral perspective. But my goal is to, if there's shame around an activity that brings them a lot of joy and brings other people a lot of joy, I'm going to go for the kink affirming, and I'm going to ask them, what brings you joy? What brings you discomfort? Who have you done this with? In what way? Has it always been consensual? It's quite a conversation.
Yeah. Yeah. And I always try to stay wholly affirming. It's more affirming of the pathologizing or not is
I do
where,
not.
yeah, that's
I
what I,
don't. Yeah. No, because I don't, this isn't, here's the thing in the DSM, they're getting there. But you realize pedophilia as an action is mixed in with this paraphilia section. That's the sickness history that we have. But what happened in the recent DSM, and that is the DSM TR, the 5TR. Many people are still looking at that 2013, and there's some important differences in there from 2013 to the more recent one. And the TR has, I think it's the TR, but it has clarified the difference between a paraphilic disorder
uh,
and a paraphilia. You cannot diagnose it if it's not causing problems in their life, much like taking homosexuality out of it in 1973. Pathology and oppression, you're going to have reactions to it, but it's not a disorder. The
yeah.
disorder might be depression as a result, and you see it out there on Instagram all the time now that they're like, is it like from non-therapists, is it depression or is it the traumatic experiences you've had? Blah, blah, blah. Yes, we know that. We're only calling it major depression, not even depression as a diagnosis. So we can do research, talk to each other without having a paper to explain what's going on. And then we individualize our treatment, right? So that's where I'm at with it. And I think there's a lot of problem with the paraphilic disorder, in my opinion, because we're looking at antisocial personality if it becomes non-consensual in an intentional way most of
Yeah.
the time. most of the
Sweet.
time.
Thank you so much. I'm going to pop it in there, but I had a question about documentation, but that can be after anything else that happens.
Absolutely. And I'm happy to talk with any of you by Zoom. I love talking more than writing. God forbid, that doesn't show much in the our publications at all, but I like to talk. So no problem.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you, Autumn. Our next question is going to be from Mary Knapp. Are you familiar with Sexual Health Alliance for training to become ASEX certified? And is there any different site you'd recommend?
Yeah, I am familiar with them. There's about 10 different places you can do that. ASEX certified sex training. One of the more common ones is Modern Sex Therapy Institute as well. Linda Weiner also has one. University of Minnesota did have one. University of Wisconsin, Stout had one, but with the new politics, I think they have to get rid of it, unfortunately. Um, there's a lot of ones, but what I would do is look up ASEX certification programs, and you usually get a whole bunch of them. If they say that it's an ASEC program, chances are they are going to do it. What do you look for in those programs? Do they offer supervision? Do they offer the hours of supervision needed? If they do, that's part of your finances. If not, you're paying for that on your own, and it's pricier than regular supervision. If, as AMFTs, you want to double dip and start that, find someone who's ASEC certified and an MFT and a supervisor to all those things, you can count those hours for both sex therapy certification and your licensure for MFT, which is a great way to go. It's a lot, and it can be pricey depending on it. But there are few supervisors out there who do sliding scale, but not a lot. The ASIC certification site is complicated. I'm happy to help explain it in another time. But oh wait, brain whatever. What was the question again, Darby?
Are you familiar with Sexual Health
Oh
Alliance
yeah.
for training to become ASEX certified? And is there a different site you recommend?
Yeah, so there's a lot out there. The thing is about Modern Sex Therapy Institute, I have mixed feelings. They're giving out PhDs that aren't real PhDs. There's no research. I know people in the program. It's just kind of like, I'm a doctor, I can be an Instagram sexpert now. But realistically, it's not a legit PhD from a research university. So I have like issues with that. But their ASEX sex therapy certification, they do it all. They even help you fill out this ridiculous 40,000 page application. You don't have to have ASIC certification to do this. You have to have training. So I do want to remind you of that. The certification gives you an extra credential that people do look at, though. Does that help? Does that answer your question?
It does. Thank you. I was at my internship site.
Oh, there
I
you are.
get a lot of questions um,
Yeah,
from some of my clients, and so I wanted to get more information.
yeah.
And I'm the only MFT there, so I've
Okay.
reached out to another MFT in my area who is ASEC certified. She is
Awesome.
AAMFT approved, and so she was, kind of giving me the information, and I wanted to get more so that way I can be informed. So,
They
so
will often tell you this is what I did and it worked for me. I mean, that's what we do sometimes, but there's a lot out there. They're going to have different financial things, and so familiarizing yourself with the guidelines for AMFT will help.
thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Mary.
Okay, our next question, and I think it's important even though it's from Autumn again, so I just want to make sure we
That's
ask it
okay.
because it's a great question. I might be biased, she's in my internship, but I'd love to know any phrases you commonly use in documentation with kink sex work as well as BDSM. So far, I'm mostly using things like client reported that power exchange dynamics are a meaningful aspect of their identity relationship and explored how this aligns with their personal values and emotional needs, or client expressed concerns regarding stigma, disclosure, and acceptance of their identity, or client explored the impact of their work on mental health, relationships, and self-perception.
All of that sounds great, Autumn. It's going to depend on the client. I don't necessarily, I'm in private practice. I'm not with insurances. My notes are like, they are in a steel box. Like you, especially with the clientele I work with, they're going to have to do a lot to get my notes out of me. Obviously, you have psychotherapy notes and case notes, and those are different legally of what can be pulled. But generally speaking, if I've ever had any had around this kind of thing, if I've been pulled to court or if I've been asked to subpoena, you do have an option to ask to be deposed, and that's what I do.
Got it. Perfect. Being an internship, it's all getting, put through a fine-toothed comb. So I'm being very, very aware of my language,
Yeah, yeah.
not putting anything out there.
And you want to, as you're talking about these things, like it sounds like you have already a good enough knowledge to be able to be careful. Um, One of the things that I think is important about this is there's still so much stigma. This is a whole overarching thing about protecting your notes. and how you can do that when you are putting them into a system, particularly the Medicaid system or Medicare system. When you're putting them in the system, be very brief and then keep your case notes separate.
Yeah,
And
and
they
that's
say it, yeah.
leaning with all of it, and then especially as the crossover then with queer and trans and like gender discussion, I'm
Mhm.
pulling everything out.
Yeah. I mean, and that's, I'm pretty, especially now,
Yeah,
with all the access to private information that's everywhere. I think that's really smart.
yeah, great. Thank you so much.
Yeah.
Okay, Coreen, we have one more question I see. So this is from James. Dr. Haim, could you speak toward how systemic relational case conceptualization that would occur within a dyad or more, that an off-the-rack LMFT with an ID client that may have a kink-centered adjacent?
All right. I need to read this. Hang on.
Yeah, I was like, it's a little. It should be the second one from the bottom.
This is James. Yes. Hi, James. Okay. Could you speak to how systemic relational case conceptualization that occur with the dyad? I'm going to start with the dyad because it gets more complicated with more. That an off the rack, what do you mean off the rack LMFT?
So we get our training, we get licensed, where we encounter an identified client that somehow the presenting concern is revolving around kink.
Okay.
Where, because you said like we may not be able to call ourselves sex therapists by the certification, but we do have the training to do some sex therapy.
Yep.
So I'm kind of trying to figure out, well, where should we, how do we know when we've kind of reached the end? Like with
Oh.
cognitive behavioral therapy, like there's a certain point where I'm like, you need to go see someone that really focuses on this if you want to do it like this.
Hmm. So here's the thing. And I saw Valens comment. I do want to talk about FetLife a little bit too, because that is, I've been on that site since the initiation of that site, and it's gone through a lot of changes. So I definitely want to talk about that as well. So still trying to process this. So you can't necessarily call yourself a sex therapist, but you can do all the same things that sex therapists do because of our MFT degree. So what I say is I have experience and, in sex therapy. I've been working in sex therapy for many, many years. Now, as far as when to refer out, I have a lot of feelings about referrals, and I do believe referrals can be really good, but I think too many happen these days. And if you get multiple referrals when you're part of a marginalized community, it don't feel good. It does not feel good. And that can be really, really harmful over time. Now, what I do is explain, right, your scope of competency is sex therapy. You are trained to do it at a low level. You know, you have one class and everything. Yeah, except for maybe one class. It's not a 10-week. I mean, it's not like a 10-day class. It's a 10-week class. It's a university class, a COMFT accredited class. That's going to give you baseline understanding and knowledge of all these things. Your training is going to happen through your internship, so your postgrad internship, through your experience. Where do you train? What do you do? Certification is just a business. I can say tomorrow I'm providing a certification in whatever, charge you for it, and hand you a thing that says certification. So be aware of when certification is needed and not as much as you can. Personal experience does not equal clinical experience. We feel like it does, it doesn't. And I've learned that the hard way. Being a part of the queer community, at the very beginning, I'm like, oh, I can just do this. Until I realized that my experience is, guess what? My experience. So it is important to people who are even more into kink and have practiced it are going to have more bias than some other people who are just in that neutral zone. So we have to be very, very careful about what we think, what our experience is versus what the research says, and combining those things together. So scope of competency is going to depend, and this is always a weird thing. This is not, and this is something that's happened in the past 10 years, this is not a black and white line. So what I do with my clients is, and this is what you can do as well, here's the background I have. Here's what I know. Here's the training I have. If so inclined in these certain situations, I'm part of that marginalized identity or community, or I dabble. That's up to you. But self-disclosure can be a slippery slope, so you have to be very careful with that kind of thing. But in marginalized communities, it can be really helpful. That being said, I offer them what I offer them. And I give them as much as I can about what I know and what I may not know and what they're going to have to tell me. Then let them choose. I'm an intern. I have a supervisor who's really good at this. I don't have as much experience, but I'm learning. Would you still like to see me? That puts the power back in the hands of the client. That puts the power back in their choice. They're not being rejected by 3 or 4 therapists in a row who say, oh, I don't have the competency, when it's more discomfort than anything. Does that help answer that question?
Yes, very much. Thank you.
Excellent. Autumn,
Uh,
hi.
I was like, this is one I know we've talked about, but she said, I
You and I,
promise
you and I.
last one. Yep.
It's
I,
okay.
yeah, this is everything me and just so you guys know, this is my supervisor, Dr. Coreen Haym, and she is amazing in all of this, like actually as your supervisor. I'm curious around self-disclosure, involvement in these communities, small town communities, or smaller subset, and the potential crossover with clients in a way that is different than a grocery store spotting.
Okay. I'm gonna do a little self-disclosure myself here. It's happened to me, and it was terrible for everybody involved. Terrible, bad, horrible. My suggestion is, and I actually talked to a person who's an intern, who's not my intern, thank goodness, who was like more in the consensual non-monogamy kind of swinger situation. And she's like, oh, I always see those clients at these pool parties. And I'm like, and she's topless or naked. And she's like, but we just stay on the other sides, and we've found a way to work this out. Not only can she get sued for that, but I can't tell you the unbelievable amount of problems with that, in so many ways. You know how weird it is when you run into your therapist at Starbucks? Take this times 4,000. You have to have a separation of your therapist self, who's a lot of you, and your self. There's crossover. So honestly, Autumn, if this is the population you're working in, personally, I have to go out of town. Keep it in the bedroom or go out of town. I don't know where you are. It may still happen, but I've had play parties where I'm like, look, I don't need to know, the names of people that are there. I can't disclose my clients. And then after a while, they're like, look, they ask, I just don't do it in town anymore. I'm a nomad at this point anyway, so it's fine. And I don't even have a chance to develop community. I'm 2 months here, 2 months there. Um, but it is yeah, I'm sorry is the answer to that one. Just go to conferences, have fun in conferences, have fun in your own relationships. Conferences are a really good way to get that out. And as we know, there's many, many, many kink conferences. And does that surprise anybody that we have conferences? They're not just play parties, conferences. A little bit. Okay, cool. Thanks, Kiara. So our conferences look a lot like regular conferences. It does make sense though, right? They look a whole lot like regular conferences. There's different focuses, different kinds of a lot of times there's a pageant, where people get leather titles, and those are really cool. They run a lot like a beauty pageant, but beauty is not what it's about. They talk, they do their questions, they do a scene on stage, which is kind of cool, usually with music and creativity, well planned out scene. They talk about the community and their advocacy in the community, and then they get a little title. So the conferences, and I don't mean, what's that one that's popping around right now? It's more like anybody know? It's like, oh God, there's one that's popping around. It's not a conference. It's a big performance. It's a moneymaker. They have all the stuff on, like fetish stuff on the stage, but it's not really that. So what conferences look like is you register and you find your little breakout rooms, and it's education. At night, often there's play parties, and they're usually geared towards certain things. There's pageants, there's movie screenings, lots of education, lots of leaders in the community, lots of socializing. So it's a lot of fun. There's usually a little bit of come down for people after those conferences.
Okay. Well, we have a couple more questions if you're okay for us moving
Yep,
forward. Thank
yep.
you, Adam. Is the research there to support depathologizing CNM as it is there for BDSM and kink? And can we say to clients that it isn't related to trauma?
Yes, and yes.
Okay. Uh,
The name, and
oh,
really quickly, the name of the researcher who does so many good things with CNM is, oh, okay, this is going to be hard because I don't remember his last name, but it's Heath, like Schlesinger. I apologize. I should have had his stuff ready. But there, in both consensual non-monogamy and BDSM, there are some fantastic research articles that are clinical guidelines, like I said, which okay, sub drop, yeah. And actually, there's a dom drop, but I will.
okay. So our next question is, would
You,
munches be more appropriate so you could still have community? And if you run into a client, certainly you aren't unclothed.
I would say munches are still a problem. Munches are usually not, munches are social events, not necessarily meant to be play parties. There's often a lot of like plain clothes dress. They might have their little leather vest on or something. But munches usually happen at restaurants. In Vegas, they happen at a bar because it's Vegas. Um, so I would say that munches are still a problem. Like it's as you become a therapist, socializing with your clients is not a good idea. It just isn't. As a matter of fact, you can't. Let's just be real. And it's not because you can't like a law, because I know at the beginning I'm like, this is stupid, da 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 da, until you see what happens, until you have the experience to see how that. And if you understand Valen or Valen,
Valen.
Valen, and Valen, if you think about power dynamic that you already pretty much know a bit about,
Hmm.
that power dynamic between the therapist and client never goes away.
So I guess more I'm asking like if it's not a guaranteed like you're gonna run into clients, maybe you don't have a lot of clients in the community, maybe if you
Okay.
would that be more appropriate? Like you still run the chance of running into a client, but like
Yeah.
there's not like that you are gonna run into them for sure.
Okay, yes, absolutely. And that's with any situation. Like in the lesbian community, I started seeing lesbians right away. I was like, great. And then I couldn't go out. I couldn't go out. They were my clients. So it depends on the community, but absolutely you can do what you want to do. But just like a lot of things, you may have to exit
Hmm.
if they're there. And that's
Yeah.
usually how I do that.
Okay. So
Munches
just
are
kind of
much safer though.
yeah, that's why I'm like, but it's kind of like the leave if you do see them, but otherwise,
Same thing. Yeah.
yeah,
Yeah, I think munches are fine because you're not, you have your clothes on
yeah,
most of the time.
yeah.
I think you missed one of them. I just
Uh,
saw India.
did I miss it?
India, I think India up there at 1040 said, what's the right above Tracy
Oh,
Powers?
I'm still on Bethany. Can you please discuss the concept of subdrop?
This one was above that.
Oh, okay.
So it's what's the difference between a sex BDSM kink conference for therapists versus a normal community conference? So the one that I know for a kink research conference, it used to be called CARAS. There's some leaders in the community in Chicago who do a lot of work with those conferences. The difference is most of us are in the kink community in some way, and that's specifically what we'll talk about. Whereas a community conference is going to be non-research oriented. Does that make sense? And then a BDSM convention conference is where it's just fun with education in the kink community. So there's a lot of crossover there too. Does that answer a bit, India?
Yeah, I think I was more wondering if like I feel like I'm a very kink and BDSM affirming therapist, but I don't
Yay.
practice myself.
Right.
I've had
Even
friends
better.
in the community. I've had friends in the community. I've always been around it, but personally, if I were to go to a conference, it would be for educational purposes. I
Fantastic. Yeah.
play parties, and so I just want to know what's an appropriate conference for me to go to. Like I don't want to accidentally go to the one where it's all play, and I'm like, I actually wanted to really just learn how to apply this with my clients, not.
Yeah. I would say ASECT conferences, Quad S, Society for this sexuality.org, I think, whatever. People are doing great at finding this for me, but it's the Society for the Scientific Study of Sexuality. I prefer ASECT in the conferences, and you can go to the kink things you need. There's a couple kink aware conferences, and you can go to a regular kink conference that's just for the community. But I wouldn't go to the play parties as just a voyeur unless it's something that was interested in you, because then it's like a non-consensual research. Because now
Mm,
you're observing people for only research purposes rather than your own enjoyment.
right. Okay.
Good,
Thank
great
you.
question. Okay, go ahead. Got Van. Okay, go ahead.
I believe that's good. So as far as what's in the chat, if anyone wants to raise their hand, and again,
Oh,
this is
there's
is there more?
Bethany. Yeah, sub drop.
Oh, yes, now subdrop. My
Okay,
apologies. I'm
sub
getting ahead of
drop. Yeah,
myself.
it's okay. Sub drop is what the people in the. Here's the thing: BDSM can bring you to some really beautiful states that people call spiritual. Much like drugs, they push the endorphins in our system, and it's people will have very intense spiritual and or healing experiences. When I talked about healing and BDSM in that way in one of my other conferences, in one of my other presentations, this was for the BDSM community, and I was just kind of searching around quite a few years ago, and I asked, how many of you have had a cathartic or beautiful experience with this? There's about 30 people, every single one of them raised their hand. So knowing that we have endorphins flying, there's even more things to be concerned about. So if you're at even an event, it's an event that's for 3 or 4 days, or just something that you do with your partner, you feel pretty great. And if you don't, then we need to talk about that. You can feel pretty great. And you can be in this mindset. And this can be for a sub or dom or a top and a bottom. And PS, top and bottom, sub and dom, very different. You can be a bottom dominant, you can be a top sub, you can be verse, you can be switch. There's a lot of things. There's no rules around that. Um, but for anybody, sub drop was the original term because submissives were in a place where they didn't have to make a whole lot of decisions potentially. It was very freeing, as described, and also the physical of it. If you are doing physical things, which you may not be, sometimes it's just mind, and talking. But if you're doing physical things that are causing that feels good to you, but your body is responding to them as pain, the endorphins start flowing. The pleasure starts flowing. The sounds we make in pain and pleasure are very similar. The spot in the brain that lights up is exactly the same. So pleasure and pain is confusing. They're just messages to the brain of how you experience them. That being said, there is a drop. There is a little bit of a sadness, a little bit of a drop, almost like a come down from drugs. So that is a time for a lot of nurturance, a lot of what we call aftercare. Aftercare looks different for everybody. We don't just do it and walk away unless that was discussed and continues to be consensual. But aftercare is important, whether it's happening with someone else, the person you're doing things with, or even yourself. But aftercare is critical. So sub drop happens like that, and it doesn't feel good. It feels like I said, the best way to describe it is a come down from these endorphins. You know, Dom drop happens too because you're in a. Anybody write a lot when you get into that mode of writing and you're just flow? It's that flow state we talk about. It's a lot like that. You're in this flow state, and then when it's gone, the difference can make you feel like a little sad, or a little like remnants of depression because it's chemical. And DOMs will have that too because they get into flow states without any what's perceived as pain, which if it's actually painful, that's not what we're talking about. Um, with a slow buildup of certain kinds of activities, it's very pleasurable for some people. And mind you, we're still in the minority, and that's another thing that concerns me about the media representation is everybody feels that they have to have a kink or they have to be this and they have to be that. And I find that to be a little bit dangerous too, taking things step by step with education, slowly and understanding, and hopefully a community if you can. Online research is generally not enough to keep you completely safe or as safe as you can be.
I do know, and I
Um,
would love for just a second for you
yeah,
there's a really interesting correlation between sub drop is kind of unknown for BDSM beginners, and it can create
right.
really significant, like for me personally, it's like next morning mental health issues. You get that cortisol dump, and then you're managing all of the switchback from the deep
And
hormone.
particularly if you already have some mental health issues on top of it, right?
Exactly. And so
Yeah.
I see a connection between the unknown input, stressor input, interpersonal and intimate partner conflict,
Absolutely.
right? And I would just love to hear you speak to this because I feel
Yeah.
like it's one of the sneakiest aspects of this population that, is really important to talk about. So thanks. And thanks.
Yeah, no, I appreciate that, Bethany. There's another thing called frenzy too that happens at the beginning with beginners, right? Where it's just like you want to do everything, everything. And there are predators in every community, everywhere. So, um, a slow start, as much as you want to just dive in and have frenzy, is highly recommended, and I recommend it for our clients as well. Um, but when you have other mental health issues, and it is the unknown, Bethany, so I appreciate you saying that. And this is where we need to learn a little bit. Um, they're feeling all these other mental health issues. It can be perceived as simply a result of the practice, and not necessarily a physical response to euphoria. The taking away of euphoria or the taking away of these feelings. And so I think that, like Bethany said, we are systems therapists. How many systems are going on here? There's an interpersonal relationship, there's a romantic relationship. Whatever the authority exchange is or is not could be confusing for people. And so I think that often the next morning, some people it's right away, but you do need time to come down for things. But often the next morning, if you're already feeling this, other mental health issues that you already have are coming up, people can misperceive that this is caused by kink. And so I think that the knowing of that and the education of that is critical. And I really appreciate you bringing that up. Also, to mention, not everybody experiences subdrop. Not everything includes the common spanking or those kind of things. Not everything includes a like sadism and masochism in a consensual way is one part of the very large umbrella of BDSM, kink, and authority exchange. Do you have anything to add to that, Bethany? Because I'm not sure if I hit everything that you were thinking about.
I think that sounds great. Yeah, I do know that yeah, we just really need to protect our mental health through that oxytocin
Yes.
connection of aftercare. So I guess that's what I would add is
Thank
what we're
you. Yeah.
chasing is oxytocin from partners. So whatever way that resonates with client is the best way to encourage that kind of safety.
100%. Beautiful. I'm putting the kink guidelines in for everybody right now. Thank you, Bethany. So these are relatively recent. It's 2019, but the article by Richard Sprott, he's like kind of the king of kink psychology. He's not your Dom, though. So if you ever run into him, remember that. But he writes beautiful research. Um, do.
We are getting a couple more questions, Coreen, and I know we're getting to the end, so
Let's do it.
I might skip a few just because we are at a lack of time, but they're kind of encompassing FetLife. Someone's really appreciative that this isn't brought up in the Asian community. Someone wanted more information about things like sub and dom drop and how to help those clients later afterwards, and what does that look like? Uh,
Okay, one at a time.
I know. Well, I mean, because we're in the last 5 minutes, I'm just giving you a couple
Oh,
of them, and then you pick
okay.
which one you think. And someone's
Okay.
just asking what books, podcasts, or
Okay.
articles do you recommend? And I figured that might be a better start because it sounds
Yeah,
like we could go on for 3 hours and still not stop asking. So if you want to
absolutely.
share some resources maybe on a couple of these subjects just to help them along.
Sure. I do heavily promote somebody called Sinclair Sexsmith. Why? Because they are very aware of working with different populations within the kink community. They are very, very clear about asexuality and the ace people who are still in BDSM. There may not be sex, but they're having pleasure in other ways. Um, they're also aware of the different ethnicities and races who are unseen. And somebody said about Asian, I would say that is the most unseen population that I've seen in my experience. I do see more Black people getting in and being more open about it, which is wonderful because this does have a history of being pretty white, but I'm seeing a lot of change there. Queer people have generally been accepted, but it's a lot better now in our spaces. Now, I think, oh, thanks. Thanks, Roxanne. Appreciate you. So be careful about podcasts. And the reason I say that, or Instagram experts, is are they really trained in this? Or is it their experience? If you're just looking at their experience, take it as that, not proper education. What I would say is, and Dr. Beman, they have access to a good library, not just the ones in their courses. Is that correct?
Yeah,
Like
well,
a
you mean
research they have.
our library?
Yeah, it's EBSCO
Yeah,
and all of that, right?
I'm pretty sure.
So I've used some other ones. So you have access to academic articles. I would start there in your education. I know it's not necessarily, but Darby has a nice little thing where you can make an article into a podcast for yourself. So
Notebook LM.
you can take an notebook LM, take an academic article and make it into a podcast if you'd rather listen. There are at the kink guidelines I put in there, there are some good resources at the bottom. FetLife is not a resource, it's a social activity. FetLife, many people in the kink community have a FetLife profile. Your FetLife profile can be as anonymous or non-anonymous as you want to make it. There's lots of privacy, different things you can do with it. When you jump onto FetLife, what you'll see is a lot of BDSM of white heterosexual couples in their 20s. So Justin Lehmiller, I just actually saw him at Quad S. I really appreciate his research. Yeah, he is great. And there's some others too that are working, that are just fantastic. There's some really great people out there. Pilar something something is wonderful. I really appreciate Justin's work though. I really, really do. But if
Um,
you put in,
I don't mean to cut you
you have to
off.
stop.
We
Okay,
Yeah, we
no
are
problem.
last few minutes, and I do want to make sure that we respect everyone's time, including your own. Um, we want to thank you, Dr. Coreen Haym, for taking the time on such an amazing and beautiful discussion and subject, right? I think we could have gone on all day and we still wouldn't have enough time. Thank you, everyone, for attending today. We really appreciate you. Before you log off, please know if you need your hours, you need to put in your core elms, Roxanne Bayman. So she's the one you're going to put, not who you're currently in internship. Put Roxanne Bayman. Please let your friends know that as well so there's no confusion. I will be sending her the list of names. I've already copied them into there. If for some reason you forgot to put your name, go ahead and email me at darby.sams@outlook.com. I'll put it in the chat. If anyone wants to stick around for the next 15 minutes, me and King will be here to answer some DK questions. I know Roxanne, Bayman, and Coreen Haym both have to go, but they are excellent resources. Please reach out to their emails. They've been nothing but kind to me and Delta Kappa. I'm sure if you needed more information or wanted time to chat, they are great resources. Spill the tea or not, right? So feel free to do what you need to do. If anyone has any questions, please stick around. But I just want to say thank you, Dr. Coreen. Oh, yes.
Real quick question. There's a book out there that'll cover all this. It's amazing and it's called Becoming a Kink Aware Psychotherapist. Little book, wonderful.